Inquiry concluded that killing badgers to try to reduce TB in cattle would not be cost effective. But Sir David King is saying tonight that it would be biologically effective. Farmers in the main want the badger population reduced. People generally want the badger saved. Amid a bad year for farmers with the plagues of foot and mouth and blue tongue, has the badger now become fair game? Also, badgers should be culled to stop the spread of tuberculosis in cattle, the government's chief scientist has declared. Sir David King said destroying the creatures in some parts of the country was the best available option to tackling the rising levels of TB amongst cattle. But that contradicts the government's own independent study published this summer, which said culling badgers was not the most effective way of controlling the disease. DEFRA said tonight ministers were still considering a range of options. No decisions on culling were imminent. Kamian Zeram has this report.
The latest threat to England's cattle farmers, badgers. Bovine TB spread largely by them, infections rising last year by nearly 20%. Livestock farmers haven't had it easy of late. This summer seeing the return of foot and mouth and emergence of blue tongue. Now, the threat of TB. Yet only 3 months ago, another government study found badger culling would need to be conducted on such a wide scale it would be uneconomical. The then DEFRA Secretary David Miliband was reported as saying starting to cull again would be very controversial. Sir David King's comments today appear to be a complete change of direction. The author of the previous study, Professor John Vaughan, says the King report is far from comprehensive.
It does seem to be lacking in detail in that there's reference to reducing the impact of migration of badgers without any indication how you're going to do that. There's an indication that badger removal programs should be sustained without explaining what that means. It's suggested that the removal process must be effectively and humanely carried out by competent operators without explaining what that means. So it's very short on detail, and I think it's a very superficial document in that respect.
The National Farmers Union has long wanted to cull. Regular pre- and post-movement testing of cattle, they argue, simply can't contain bovine TB, a position long contested by animal rescue campaigners. The Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee meets this Wednesday to discuss Professor King's report, although DEFRA say any decision to reverse the cull ban won't be anytime soon.
Kamian Zeram reporting. Well, a short time ago I spoke to the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir David King, began by pointing out that the scientific justification for a cull is not clear-cut.
Well, the work of the independent scientific group, which has been going on for about 10 years now, has finally been reported on, and it is clear from that TB in the cattle population in Britain is closely associated with TB in badgers. In other words, they show, for example, that in some areas the prevalence of TB rising from badgers is up to as much as 40%. So the first thing is that the tests directly show the relationship between TB in badgers and TB in cattle. The second thing is that, and we agree entirely with the report on this, of course this means that we need to focus very clearly on controlling TB in cattle. But where we disagree is in terms of managing that process without managing the TB in badgers.
Well, I mean, one of the key findings surely is that a badger cull is not cost effective.
Yes, and I'm not, in my analysis, putting forward any notion of cost effectiveness, but simply looking at the science. So my analysis is based on a quite simple, widely accepted principle that if you're trying to control TB in a farm herd, you're not going to eliminate it if it also exists in the wildlife.
How many badgers would you have to kill in order to eliminate TB?
You're quite right in asking the question in order to eliminate TB in both the badgers and the cattle. And I'm not going to give you a number, but I would suggest that in the region where there is TB prevalence in cattle herds, then we ought to be looking at an elimination of something like 70 or 80% of the badgers in those areas. But it is, of course, only in those areas where TB is currently present in cattle herds.
Yes, but we're talking about 300,000 badgers in Britain, I believe. That's sort of thought to be a rough estimate. Therefore, we're probably talking about 50, 60, even 100,000 badgers that have to be killed.
You're talking about significant numbers of badgers that would have to be killed and significant numbers of cattle that are currently also being killed with TB. And all of this is in order to prevent future cattle and also badgers from contracting the disease.
Blue tongue, foot and mouth, farmers are having a tough time. What better than then suddenly to spring into action and do what they want, which is to authorise the gassing of badgers?
This is not an issue for me. This is an issue that politicians may take into account. But you will know that I am an independent voice in government on scientific matters. This is simply looking at the science. And my report doesn't take into account any other factors than the science.